Hi AP Chemistry students! In your titration challenge tomorrow, you will design and perform an experiment in an attempt to correctly reproduce a titration curve provided by Mrs. Nielsen. Before performing the titration, it is necessary to choose the correct chemicals first by using your knowledge of acids and bases. You will have various chemicals available to choose from. 0.1 molar acetic acid, which is a weak acid, 0.2 molar ammonia, a weak base, 0.2 molar hydrochloric acid, 0.05 molar nitric acid, and 0.1 molar sulfuric acid, all of which are strong acids. Lastly, you will have 0.1 molar sodium hydroxide, a strong base. Your chemicals of choice depend on your titration curve's starting pH, equivalence point pH, and ending pH. A strong acid, strong base combination will have a very low starting pH and very high ending pH, with an equivalence point pH around 7. A weak acid, strong base combination will have a higher initial pH, a high ending pH, and an equivalence point greater than 7. A strong base, strong acid combination will have the opposite starting and ending pHs of a strong acid, strong base combination, starting very high and ending very low, with an equivalence point pH around 7. Finally, a weak base, strong acid combination will have a lower starting pH at around 11, an ending pH around 3, and an equivalence point pH less than 7. After choosing your chemicals, you must next choose an appropriate indicator to use. Strive to choose an indicator that has a transition interval around the equivalence point in your titration curve, so that when the endpoint is close to being reached, you know to titrate in smaller increments. Although there are many more indicators to measure pH, you will have 3 to choose from. Phenolphthalein, which changes color between 8.2 and 10, methyl red, which changes color between 4.4 and 6.2, and thymolphthalein, which changes color from 9.3 to 10.5. The equivalence point and endpoint are not the same and cannot be used interchangeably. The equivalence point is when the moles of acid are equal to moles of base, whereas the endpoint is when the indicator changes color. Now that you've chosen your chemicals and indicator, it is important to consider some of these elements of experimental design to obtain the most accurate results. Here is the setup of the experiment. The burette will contain the titrant, and the beaker will contain the analyte. Clean and rinse the burette before beginning to ensure that any substance besides the titrant has been run out. Rinse the pH meter with distilled water before using it to measure the pH after each increment of titrant is added. Be sure to measure from the bottom of the meniscus of the burette so as to minimize error when you do your calculations later on. If titrant gets on the side of the beaker, it is okay to rinse it off with distilled water, as the addition of the water does not affect the system reaction. Now it is time to take on the titration challenge with your newly equipped knowledge. Happy titrating!